Good afternoon, everyone. Now we're just going to check our audio because we've had a few problems this afternoon. Technology is wonderful when it works, and I'm going to blame myself for not being the best user of it. Just checking. We'll just have a look through now. Just a reminder to everyone that's listening in that if you are having problems with your audio and you can't hear us, do check your audio buttons. You are muted from our end, however, that doesn't stop you from hearing. So worst case scenario, jump on your phone and we find that the audio through the phone is usually very good. So it's my absolute pleasure today to bring to you Gareth Edgecombe. Now hopefully, Gareth, is your audio going? Are you okay there? Oh, just check that we've unmuted you. Jess.
Yeah, so Gareth, it just looks like you're on self mute there, so you just need to unclick that and then you should be good to go.
Thanks, Julia. How's that?
Oh, yay. Yeah, now, Gareth, a while ago, when we actually first started these webinars, the feedback we got from people was they really wanted to understand more about the fresh produce export market. And so I'm incredibly excited to have you here today. I have got your bio, which I thought was really cool. I love the fact that you kind of started at food with Coca-Cola, and then you've gone into Campbell Soup, and then you went into Comfort Group in Australia, and then you've circled back in 2018 into T&G Global Limited. And you know, your experience, from what I can see, and I have Google stalked you extensively, that you know you are about creating high performing businesses and really turning businesses around and turning them into something very special. So I'd love to sort of get a bit of a demographic or an understanding from you as what is T&G Global?
Yeah, thanks, Julia. Just to start with a bit of history on T&G Global, for those that don't know it, I obviously remember it as Turners and Growers, and T&G Global really started out about 122 years ago now, and that was started by a guy, Edward Turner, who started basically a fresh produce trading and markets business, and then over the years it's become many different things. In more recent years, it acquired the NZX assets and brands, so a lot of the apple and pear board assets, and then a bunch of acquisitions in markets such as Delica, and then orchards, both here in New Zealand and offshore. So it's quite a combination of different businesses, but all have been in the fresh produce space. And if I was to describe the nature of the business, it's really, one is growing for New Zealand markets and for offshore in large, particularly in apples. We also have a trading desk where we acquire from large growers and then sell into global markets. And then here in New Zealand, we've got quite a strong presence in physical markets, physical fruit and vegetable markets, and logistics, as well as the growing entities.
That's fantastic. It's I've got to be honest, most of my experience is in the pastoral space, and other than doing a few years of actual horticulture and growing vegetables at high school, you know, I think my knowledge of the industry, and I don't know if New Zealand actually understands how significant a contribution that our fresh produce industry actually brings through. I mean, how big is the company? Is it? I mean, so how many countries did you say you're in, Gareth?
Oh, we're across 80 odd countries that we sell into. We've got physical presence in around about 20 countries, and yeah, and as you say, you know, you think about the New Zealand scene with the T&G trucks driving around servicing the New Zealand markets. You know, that's a really important business for us that we're continuing to grow, but that's really servicing the 5 million Kiwis. But there's a huge world out there, and generally speaking, the markets, particularly the Asian markets, are booming in their desire for fresh fruit and vegetables. And New Zealand is really well set up to be able to service that market, both in terms of its you know, the proximity to markets, as well as the brand image of New Zealand in those markets. So yeah, it's the horticulture scene in New Zealand a lot of it does go offshore, and so it doesn't get seen. And a lot of our strategy is related to accelerating our growth for those offshore markets.
Awesome, which benefits New Zealand, right? And I think that sometimes we get a bit confused with that us exporting is incredibly good for our country, and then it actually benefits our local regions, our growers, and I guess the more value you can get, the better or more you can bring back to your growers.
Yeah, and I think that's a really important point. New Zealand, we sit down at the bottom of the world, you know, selling out to this vast world, and there's some really large players out there producing at commodity level. For New Zealand to compete on that world stage, I think we need to bring really advanced technology and great growing systems and great genetics. And that allows us to sit in that premium space, and that premium space we can play in on a global level. And if you think about the innovation that's required to be able to do that well out of New Zealand, it does require a lot of investment to do world's best growing practices, investments in genetics for the best tasting and growing fruit and vegetables. And that in turn deploys a lot of capital in New Zealand and builds a lot of skills and a depth of capability in New Zealand, which is great.
Now, I mean, I know we're all tired of hearing the words COVID, but I've got to ask, what has it impacted T&G at all, and sort of what have you had to change or do differently because of it?
I think, like every business and every person around the world, it's been a major effect, and unprecedented effect, really. And we, starting at the start, back when this started to become a global thing, we obviously had it on our radar quite early on because of the global nature of our business. And it was really at the end of March that we started to scale up our BCP, our business continuity planning, on those offshore markets. And then very quickly, if you remember, in April, it became a big deal as New Zealand went into lockdown here. And so, and that came on for everyone very suddenly. And we've got quite a complex operation, starting from orchards right through to shipping into markets. And so that affected our whole value chain right through. And so we had to scramble very quickly as we went into level 4. We were deemed an essential service, and that put a big burden of responsibility onto our team to make sure that we could continue to operate. So many people were relying on it, all of our growers, all of our team internally, but also New Zealand required us to be able to continue to produce and ship for that lockdown period. So that essential service status was the first part, but then we also needed to make sure that we could demonstrate our ability to operate in that environment. So that meant looking after our vulnerable workers, make sure we got separation places in place, and then starting to think about things such as contingencies around shipping and what if scenarios around, if this happens, then what do we do next, and really starting to think around all of those different options. And yes, we had a lot more cost coming into the business because of those things, but we were also able to second guess some of those issues and contingency plan against them. So, for example, the shipping up into Europe, we usually use third-party shipping, but we decided that we would need to charter some ships or some capacity to make sure that we locked it in and had overall higher levels of capacity than we needed, so that if something did fall over, we were ready to go. And that made a big difference.
Right, so that's some pretty significant things to think about when you're having to, I guess, realign shipping. It's not an easy task.
Yeah, and as I said, there was so much going on all at once. And I'm sure most of your listeners were in the same spot. You're having to contingency plan for all of those supply chain disruptions, work out how you're going to communicate in real time with your teams, and start thinking about making different business decisions on the fly. An example of that is, as we look to the different markets, some were accelerating in terms of consumption because people were in lockdown and fresh fruit and vegetables were in demand, and some were closing down. And so we had to look at those market signals and make real-time decisions in that sales and operations planning space, and be really agile in that space. So overall we did have more costs, but we were able to mitigate those, keep on shipping both here in New Zealand and in offshore markets, and pretty much keep the business on track. Coming out of it, also a couple of other things that were quite interesting. We did reduce our costs in a lot of areas, and as we knew we were looking at uncertain markets and uncertain returns and high costs, we went through the business and said we really want to protect our team and our structure and our investments for the future. So what costs can we look at containing in the short term to hose down those risks? And so we put a lot of effort across the team to reduce our cost of doing business, and we came up with multi-million dollars of cost savings to offset against those things. And that was great to see the team rally against that, and we were able to protect our overall team and also the long-term investments. And then the other interesting thing coming out of COVID for us, and I've heard this experience with other CEOs as well, is that the digital flexible ways of working that we were forced into, actually we found that in some places connection improved, and our ability to get through work and be productive actually improved as well. Now that wasn't uniform, but it was generally a trend. And so coming out of it, we were quite deliberate to put in a flexible working process, which really embraced digital working going forward. And that's pleasing to see that that's stuck and become part of the way that we work. So at least that's one silver lining coming out of it.
Yeah, well, it actually sounds from my perspective like there were a lot, and it sounds like you sound like a proud CEO who your team worked extremely hard and yourself to actually get through, as you say, lots of conflicting things happening at once, but to make sure that you got the products continuing to go into market. Were there any markets in particular that you found, has demand decreased, or is it literally just more of a market entry thing?
The broad question is generally fresh produce has been stable and probably slightly up overall, but within each market, quite a lot of differences. So Europe and UK generally saw an upswing in fresh fruit and vegetables as consumers hunkered down in their homes and went to supermarkets and looked to eat healthy. And then US is a bit of a mixed case, and then Asia generally has remained relatively buoyant, but quite disrupted as each physical market closed down. So you'd see each individual country experiencing different waves, and the physical markets closing down as those waves went through. And so just a very disrupted pattern in those markets. But generally speaking, and apples is probably our largest single globally exposed trading commodity, generally apples have been buoyant, and we're also quite lucky that we're in a range of our apples which have got high consumer demand, and that's stayed high through this whole period.
So, I mean, I guess that leads on to my next question, where I guess when we think of historically with T&G, the legacy was probably commodity based, and then you've moved into this very much consumer-led business. What sort of led to that change?
Yeah, that's quite a big change, and this has been part of the transformation over the last couple of years, or last 2.5 years, and that was born out of the understanding that in order for us to add real value to our growers and to our brands and PVRs, and sorry, PVRs are our plant variety rights for the genetics in our apples business in particular. We understood that we had to build demand in key markets and then build physical presence at retail in those key markets. And so the idea that if we can build 365 days a year presence in those markets, and we can build consumer loyalty behind them, then the next part of the puzzle is to then backfill that demand with supply. And that supply can come from New Zealand, but it also can come from other hemispheres that grow at a different time frame in the year. And so really, we knew that we had to build a cohesive supply base between our Northern Hemisphere our Northern Hemisphere growing and our Southern Hemisphere growing, and then tie that up together at point of market where we were building that 365 presence. Now, it's just so difficult to build that retail relationship in market without having teams on the ground. So we made that brave transition to actually build out capability in each of the key markets. So we excuse me. So what we did is we identified which of the key markets had strong potential for growth, and then worked out what sort of capability we'd need in each of those markets. And generally that's selling and working with customers, quality, repacking, and distribution logistics. So that, incidentally, that's been important through COVID, to have those teams on the ground in markets rather than relying from such a distance. Now that's that is a strategy that's been building out, and what we're seeing the benefits of that is that our brands are really well represented in those key markets, and and even this year we've seen that they've continued to have strong presence in those markets, even though it's been quite difficult. So that's that's been a big change. So that was changing from an export model to essentially an import or an in-market model. So that was a big mindset change for the teams, and a capability build. But also it meant separating the idea of growing from selling. And generally speaking, in the history, the organization that was growing it was also selling it, and it was one combined entity. And so when you break it up into a large global selling organization supported by a large global supply chain organization, they have to be brought together through a really cohesive, what we call a sales and operations planning framework. And so you've almost got a dashboard in the middle that's pulling the two ends of the business together, and that has to work quite well. So as you can imagine, the organizational changes to move to that model make it quite different. So what we found was that there was a lot of work required for people to understand the virtues and the values of that model, but then also how everyone would work differently within that. And like any change, it's the change is probably bigger than you expect going in, and takes more and more reinforcement than you expect, and the requirement to continually reinforce and communicate those changes and the benefits of those for everyone, and reinforce that, and be open to changes as they are necessary as you go through, because sometimes you do need to make some adjustments on the way. Now, I think that's been really useful, that change to the business. We've seen important for that change management process was to make sure that as we started to get wins coming through, we would celebrate those and make sure that really reinforced the strategy. And the benefits of that change to in-market models for our apples in particular has been enormous in the last year or so. We're seeing US retailers consistently stock our brands, particularly the Envy brand that we have, more and more, and that's as a result of having teams on the ground working with them. And we're seeing through Asia, we're able to achieve 365 supply by orchestrating the supply of Washington apples, and then at the end of the Washington season, plugging directly into the New Zealand season, so we don't actually miss a beat, and we've got that presence going on. And those changes have helped improve our returns and lift the volumes that we're pushing through those markets. So I think the good thing is everyone's seeing the tangible benefits of that change.
So it's consistent supply. It might come from different areas, but at least that channel that it's coming through, or the gateway, which is T&G Global, people can rely on and trust, because they know that the supply is going to come through and it's going to be top quality.
Yeah, that trust and quality is important. You know, back to the reference I talked about with New Zealand Inc. and New Zealand brand to the world, and 365 supply. If a consumer has a great experience, they'll build loyalty to that brand and go and look for it again. If they have a poor experience, it'll interrupt that brand preference. So being able to offer consistent quality the whole year round is really critical. And to do that, you've got to go right back through the value chain, right back through to growing practices, and make sure that you've got a lined up system for that. And so the team put a lot of work into internally working on our own growing, as well as our third-party independent growers, to make sure that we're all growing consistently, and then we've got great quality checks on the way through, and we've got great quality signals in the way that we price for the growing coming out of the orchards.
So is it kind of like if I have an orchard, there's kind of a blueprint, so there's an expectation of a level of quality of how I will produce, so that you can then guarantee your customer that you're getting the right quality? Yes,
well, that's right. So the program I've been describing really works in a branded variety where there's a set of genetics which produce a particular apple, and in this case, our primary ones are Envy, which is a large, sweet red flesh, a red-skinned apple, and Jazz, which is a smaller, sweet tart apple, which goes particularly well in Europe and Japan. Now, those two apples are part of a closed program where they're branded, the genetics are supporting them, and the whole growing system end to end is controlled. Now, so that whole system is quite different than the commodity apples, whereby there's not so much of a standardized process, and growers can choose which systems they go through and choose to which quality or which standards they grow to. And
Yep.
so New Zealand's really got those two models working in parallel together. And we think the over time, managing a high quality premium segment is going to be important to have branded high quality genetics in those programs.
Yeah, absolutely, and I guess it's us, or I mean us as in New Zealand, you know, or I mean T&G, sorry, owning both that license and understanding that genetics as well, isn't it?
Yeah, that's right, and that also goes to, you know, the NV program is now 15 years old, so a lot of work going on to get to where it is. We look at the demand going out into the future, and we've identified there's still significant unmet demand. And that will mean that we require further plantings, further significant plantings, in order to meet that demand, both here in New Zealand and also offshore. And so we will be continuing to look to plant ourselves and with partners to fulfill that demand in the future. And I think you'll be familiar with the Zespri story, but basically it's very similar, that they'll look out to future demand and then plant according to that future demand, and then ensure that the marketing programs and the sales development programs meet the what's coming on stream to ensure that there is demand that's meeting the supply coming on. Because the last thing we want to do is use price or price reductions to deal with volume coming on. Instead, we think about the other way, which is how do we build a consumer franchise as fast as possible in those key markets, so that as supply comes on, we've got the demand to meet that. And so, again, back to the investment, that requires investment in market development and working closely with customers, as well as building brands in those markets.
So, I mean, have there been any particular challenge? You know, has there been a particular challenge in all this that springs to mind, or you know, or a learning as such from it all?
I think the challenges have been in, as you move through those different changes, it's disruptive. So, for example, you can imagine going from an export model where you're selling into an importer to being in market yourself, and you're doing that work yourself. You're changing the nature of your relationship in that market with those importers, and so that's been bumpy and taken more work to make that work. And just generally, I think the change management of the process has been a learning as to how long that takes to embed and how to get that moving. So, you know, I think that's been quite a key change, and it is a work in progress. You know, we're continuing to build out the model, and we're continuing to build programs in it.
It's as far as, say, your grower goes, so you talked about your grower market as well. How have you sort of worked to take them on the journey with you? Because I think it's so important, regardless of what we grow in New Zealand, whether it be milk, meat, or produce, that, you know, we somehow connect our consumer to our producer so they understand what's expected. Yeah,
that's a really good question. I think part of what I've described as a model where we're essentially disconnecting the front end of the business, or the sales desk and sales development desk, from the orchard. It actually becomes more difficult to make sure that those connections are made. And so we have to be more deliberate in building communication pipelines and market signals back and forth from the market into our operations and to our growing operations. And I think, again, in terms of a work on that, has been a learning that we can continue to do that better and provide more real-time feedback. And I think, again, the use of technology, Zooms and Teams type calls, is a great way to do that, and providing frequent high quality input to that. So we'll give monthly updates around things like what's happening in each market, what's happening across varieties, and I think that's really important color, to make that connection again. Related to, also in the middle between growing and market, is also post-harvest. And right. One of the challenges, New Zealand is seeing quite a lot of investment in horticulture, and one aspect of it is the land and the development of the horticultural assets themselves. But at the same time, the post-harvest facilities that are required to, to produce high quality export cases, it's actually very high levels of investment required. Yeah. And so part of that requirement with our independent growers is to ensure that they understand that we are building or helping to facilitate the building of high quality post-harvest facilities that meet the requirements of those markets. So again, that's an important dialogue that we're having with our growers to bring that along.
And I think that's a difficult concept to get your head around sometimes, isn't it? I mean, I know in the pastoral space we're always talking about adding value, but value actually happens behind the farm gate or behind the orchard gate, or and it sounds to me, that it's about helping people understand that keeping that value of the apple. And when and so the packing, and it's very scientific and it's very technical, isn't it? There's a lot of technology. Yeah. From what I hear, I haven't been in a pack house, but I'd love to see one where there's lasers and things. It's sort of it sounds like a science fiction type of novel.
Yeah. Well, just if we could go into a bit of detail on that one. So what we look at is what we call Class 1 TCEs, or a Class 1 case. And so that a Class 1 product is one that sells into the premium markets at the premium pricing and has a certain set of attributes to meet that Class 1 standard. And our focus for all of our grower community is about maximizing the Class 1 yield, not the overall yield coming off the orchard, but that Class 1 yield, because the difference between Class 1 and the rest is vast in terms of returns. So in order to set those parameters for Class 1 and also to measure them as they come through, there's a lot of technology going in to post-harvest, or on orchard and post-harvest, to make sure that we maximize the cartons coming off the orchards. And that does involve infrared technology and such like, to be able to take photos of each apple to understand its physical attributes and its visual attributes, as well as the internal attributes, to then be able to maximize its value. So a lot of investment and a lot of Kiwi know-how actually has gone into that space. And again, that makes the hurdle for the costs of getting into that technology higher, but it guarantees that we've got that high quality supply chain coming through. And again, just another illustration of that, for example, what can happen is, just take an envy apple. If you leave it on the tree, it grows redder, and generally there is a market in Asia for red fruit. Now, the problem with that can be that if you leave it on the tree too long, it can be overripe, in layman's terms, and so you're almost, it's counterintuitive, but you're chasing the extra pricing from the color, but you're actually producing an inferior product. So we've dialed back the specs and said that what we need to have is the best tasting product, and then the characteristics of color are a secondary characteristic. And that change, again, we've seen come through in our response from the markets to say the quality of our product has improved as a result.
And are you looking at nutrition as well, or is it pretty much the tasting attributes as opposed to the nutritional content of what's going through?
If we look at other segments, like for example blueberries, we will be looking at dialing up some of the micronutrient elements of that. Overall, the apple category is still the largest fruit category in the world. It's pretty stagnant as a category, as an overall category, but the premium segment within the apple category globally is booming. So I think generally we see that consumers understand that fresh apples are inherently a great health snacking alternative, and they sit in that space of a great healthy snacking alternative. And it's quite hard to differentiate yourself as having better health attributes within that category.
Right.
And consumers in this particular category, they don't see a brand differentiation on attributes of healthier than another one as a big deal. What they do see is attributes of appearance, and then taste, crunch, sweetness, lack of floweriness, etc., as appealing. And so we have sensory against all of those to understand those things. And we're really lucky that two of our brands come out as globally the best apples on those
Cool.
attributes. Yeah, really lucky.
Yeah, it's interesting, and it's interesting, isn't it? Because I think sometimes we forget that different products have different attribute hierarchies, and so with apples, you just say you're not going to be able to differentiate and say a New Zealand apple is going to give you 3 times the amount of vitamin C, well, not legally. And however, but with the likes of micronutrients of your blueberries and that, you can actually use that attribute.
That's right. Yeah.
What about environment? Is there any kind of focus on attributes of how we produce, in the sense that we are really good at producing food? Is that an attribute that's admired overseas?
I actually don't have any hard data on that specifically. I know that when we look at the brand New Zealand Inc., it is important that we are seen as clean, green, wholesome, sustainable in our practices. And generally, that is the feedback that we get, that the New Zealand brand is really critical for building that trust in the produce that we sell. Seen as clean and green, seen as very healthy, and seen as sustainable and good practices. Now, I think the reality is we also have to back that up with continuing to improve our practices. We've got a lot of effort in that space around what we call our kaitiakitanga strategy, which is essentially acting as good custodians for all that we touch in terms of our communities, the land, looking after our people, looking after the community, and looking after the business as well. And so we've got 8 commitments around different aspects of driving our kaitiakitanga approach. Water is in there, and sustainable packaging is important. Cool. And reducing our carbon footprint is a big part of that. In fact, a really interesting project that's just been kicked off just a couple of weeks ago was a brand new anaerobic digestive plant in Ripara. And basically it takes waste, and in this case waste from all of the Auckland regional food waste, and brings it into a central place, and then basically goes through an anaerobic digestive process to turn that into biogas and fuel and essentially heat, which we then, and that's located right next to our tomato glass houses, and we pump the heat and CO2 and use the fuel to create more heat and bring that back into our glass houses to grow more tomatoes. That's a really cool project about reducing carbon footprint and bringing brand new technology to New Zealand. And it hasn't been done on the scale and used back into food glass houses in the past. That was a really exciting project to kick off a couple of weeks ago at Ripara.
And what an exceptional or great story in regards to circular economy, as we get our head around what that looks like and what that means, and you're doing it. You've got a working example of it.
That's right, yeah.
Oh, that's so cool. Will you be publicising that more? Because it's, sometimes I get to speak to people and I'm like, why doesn't everyone know these stories? They're so cool. We need to, why as New Zealanders don't we share these brilliant things that we do? Yeah.
We put quite a bit of work into making sure that was understood, and just in the noise of everything going on, sometimes goes through to the keeper. So, yeah. And I think as it gets built, so that was the announcement that it's all going ahead, and essentially the earth turning ceremony. But as we get into build and then production, I think it's going to be a really cool tech story and a circular economy story that will get more airplay.
That's awesome. I'm sure it'll be good for your ESG story as well, which is brilliant, which really helps.
Yeah.
Now,
that's right.
I'm going to ask the world's dumbest question here, but what other produce do you have? So you've got tomatoes, you've got apples, you've got blueberries. Is it just everything that's produce?
So basically, if we think about our strategy overall, we've got our first one is focused on brands and genetics, and we've really focused that on global markets, and we've focused that on apples, blueberries, and table grapes. Cool. And apples has been our legacy, and we're continuing to build those out. But we've also added recently blueberries and table grapes to those, and that means partnering to build great genetics in that space, and then building out a global position on those. So that really is large scale internationally focused on those 3 categories. And then our second strategy is essentially, as we described and had talked about before, which is having capability in market to represent those brands in market and that change. And then our third strategy is all about New Zealand and being and the needs of New Zealanders. And there's 2 parts to that. One is the physical markets, for representing the 1,000 or so growers that we represent and the 1,000 or so independent customers that go through the markets. Yeah. So that's one half of the New Zealand business. But the other half of the New Zealand business is about growing fruit and vegetables for Kiwis. And so in that place, we've got quite a range of things that we grow at a lower scale than global, but really focused around the needs of New Zealand. So that includes citrus, berries, tomatoes, apples, and then partnerships across various other crops as well. And we call that the T&G Farms and Farms Partnership area of that business, and that will continue to grow. So we'll continue to invest in that Farms Direct business, because we think that the combination of being a farmer for New Zealand and being a marketplace for New Zealand, there's really good synergies between those 2, and New Zealand's a great place to focus on from a domestic consumption point of view. So it's almost, you can almost think of it as T&G's got 2 focuses. One is a very focused, large scale offshore play, and then the other one is all about the needs of New Zealanders and New Zealand customers. And we're running it that way as well, with 2 quite distinct management models.
And I think I've heard too that I think there's a lot of work that you do with potentially surplus food too that goes into food banks and networks. So it is actually very much about helping feed New Zealand, isn't it, and keep quality produce here, as well as getting cash back to us from export.
Yeah. So I think what we're going to see coming out of COVID, and we saw this beforehand, the needs of New Zealanders who aren't getting access to fresh fruit and veg, that's continuing to grow, and we think that that's going to be a massive number over the next couple of years. All the reports from the various different food banks, etc., are saying that their demand has doubled or tripled in some cases. What we're trying to do is, through our own direct farms business and also through our connections across the market, is to really help facilitate the providing of produce into those needs. And then part of that is also what I'm hoping over time is that there is some marginal crops that are left on the fields and aren't brought through to harvest or brought through to consumers as a result of the fact that they're marginal in terms of their returns. Now, it doesn't take a lot of money to be able to convert some of that marginal crop to actually bring it in, and that in effect is an increase in the yield, which can go to these needy organisations. Now, so we're working hard on that whole process and trying to coalesce the industry around a process to make sure that we can build that. Now, and so that obviously take quite a lot of work to get that going. In the meantime, we're donating a lot through directly through these different institutions, and I actually think it's going to need to have an industry, government, and society approach to it because of the scale of it. And so I don't think industry and charity will be enough. I do think it's going to have a more scaled approach to meet the needs of Kiwis in the next couple of years. Yeah,
I agree. I'm on the board of Meet the Need, which is beef being donated into Silverfern Farms processing, and it's incredible what the demand is. But powerful nutrition into homes, right?
Yeah, that Meet the Need model, again, for the listeners that don't really know it, it's farmers who are motivated to help and want to be able to give whole beasts into the meat supply chain, knowing that also that coming out the other end, it's actually consumers that don't need that whole beef. How do you convert the value of that whole carcass into a donation? And that whole process is working really well, and I think it's really harnessed the ability of those farmers to help out. And so that model is an inspiration to us in terms of, you know, how we can get the same sort of thing going in the fresh produce space.
Awesome, awesome. Hey, look, now, you know, you have big aspirations and you want to be a world-leading growing genetics and brands business. What does success look like? How will you know when you've got there?
Well, that's a big question. Yeah, I think it is always a journey and a build, but in terms of the core of that strategy is identifying fantastic genetics through partner programs such as Plant and Food and other university type programs. And we've got a team that works really closely with these institutions to identify genetics that have great abundant farming attributes and at the same time have great consumer attributes. Because if you can find those two together, you can really create a lot of value. And so then attaching a brand to that and then building out the program and building it at scale is really what that's about. So success for us in that space is against our financial targets on those key brands is one measure, but also then, you know, having brands that are understood and are preferred in the key markets that we've decided to be in and have 365 presence. We know we'll get there when we've achieved that. And again, I think the Zespri example is a good one. They've got their Zespri Gold kiwi fruit really well represented in a lot of key markets, and you can see the scale of that program as a result of doing that. So with our apple existing brands, we're looking for that sort of scale, and then we're also looking to bring the same thing through in blueberries, table grapes, and new genetics of apples coming through. So, you know, I don't know if you can ever get there, but I think we will know that we've set up the components of that once we've been able to achieve that, you know, those individual items.
And there's importance, isn't there, in actually having a fantastically huge aspiration that you may never reach because, you know, in reality, we never get there, do we? Like, because we're always going to be moving the goalposts to do better and better and better.
Yeah. And I think that's, you know, that's the, that kind of comes back to this, you know, I don't know if you've seen the Fit for a Better World, the $44 billion challenge. Right. You know, that challenge is talking about putting $44 billion of new business through the primary sector. And that's over the next decade. And that's a big challenge. And I think that if you combine, you know, Kiwi ingenuity and intellectual property to create higher productivity than we've got now, and because we can't compete in the commodity world, you know, I think we're really going to have to use that IP to really leverage, you know, an advantage, whether it's genetics, growing systems, or processing technology. And then, so that's the first part: is do you have the IP that's better than someone else has got? Then you've got to look out to the world, because, you know, that sort of scale has to be based on global consumption, not local consumption. Yeah. And then the third part of it has to be of scale with the best growing or the best systems, and that's not cheap, and it takes large scale, long-term commitment, and you need, New Zealand's going to need to have a lot of investment, patient investment, both from offshore and from New Zealand, to sort of realize that goal. So I think if you can combine those unique IP plus you know, a view to the markets in the world, plus the capital to go after it, then you've got a chance. But you've got to create quite a compelling story to pull all those things together, and then you've got to do it in a sustainable way. So yeah, you know, I think that's the sort of challenge that organizations should be aspiring to, and we've got, you know, we're lucky we've got a lot of the attributes to, you know, to aspire to that and to help to meet that challenge that's been put out there.
Awesome. Hey, now I've got an audience question here. What opportunities will be created for New Zealand growers by T&G's transformation that are currently not available to them, i.e. market access, profitability, productivity, hedging, produce pricing?
Yeah, okay. So I think in our case, there will be probably a couple of things. We will only be focused on a few categories, and within that, a few key brands and genetics. And so for those growers that choose to be part of that program, what I think we can offer them is we work very carefully on choosing those genetics, and then working on R&D in terms of how to grow them and maximize the yield with precision horticulture, and so those growing systems that support that. So I think we can help bring that IP to those growers. And then from a markets point of view, what we can do is we can help farmers participate in a program which is quite stable. It's focused around the world. It's focused on being direct into retail and not at the vagaries of the markets, and is connected to brands. And so I think there's, for those that sign up to that sort of program, then I think there's quite an attractive long-term future. But we're not actually in a business that's going to be focused all over the place on lots of different pieces. Yeah.
It sounds to me, what I heard you say was, although you talk about dissecting the supply chain down, it feels like you've actually taken the growers a lot closer to the consumer than a commodity model could ever do anyway, by having those trusted relationships, by actually being able to directly talk with the consumer or the customer as such in regards to the attributes. So it sounds like there's lots of value for the grower supplying through to you.
Yeah, I think there's merits on both camps. If you think about one, as you described, it's closer because you've got the whole end-to-end tied up, and if you can communicate that, then that's a great aspect. But the flip side also, if you've got a model where you grow it and then sell it, and you're talking very closely to the person that's right next door to you as they sell it, then you'll also feel that you're in control of that environment as well. And so I can imagine that there'll be growers out there that want to be in both spaces, and it makes sense to be in both spaces for different reasons. And it really just depends on the outlook of each of the individuals.
Now, look, I've just got one last question for you. Looking at the primary sector, what opportunities do you see for us to accelerate our role in the world to deliver increased value?
Yeah, I think it really comes back to what I said before. New Zealand's got so much, across the sector, it's got so many different interesting things going on. And if you can attach where that IP, we can actually get hold of the IP and somehow license it or own it or patent it, so that you can actually then go and leverage it, and then find a way to build into those markets, and then find a way to get large scale investment behind it. I think it's the combination of those things that will unlock it. I don't think that the government's going to be able to pick winners, and because there's just so much going on across so many different spaces. Helping facilitate the overall general sector will be useful, but not in any individual part of the value chain or any individual segment. So yeah, and if you think about those three things, it's also going to need a really good talent pipeline coming into those roles to make that happen in all different aspects. Talent that's prepared to go offshore and represent New Zealand, talent that can bring the best growing systems through, et cetera, et cetera. And so that means we do have to be an attractive place for people to want to come and work, which means we have to tell our story about why this can be a really interesting and exciting category sector to be in. And we probably haven't done that well.
Yeah, look, to be fair, I don't think much of the sector has, and we're getting there now, and we're realising, we have a great story to tell, and there's some fantastic careers for people within the sector, regardless of what you grow. And whether you're a marketer, a grower, whatever, there are these incredible opportunities everywhere. Gareth, I'm so grateful for your time. I imagine you have got many more things to do than chat with me.
Not at all.
I kind of feel like I've heard about an organisation that has a great deal of heart, a great deal of aspiration, but really clear focus on performance. And I think when you combine all of those, that's kind of where I see success for New Zealand, where we can be really good for our own country, but also good for the world with what we're exporting.
Yeah, well said. Yeah.
So, thank you so much for your time. I look forward to chatting again, hopefully someday, and just have a great rest of the week.
Great. Thanks, Julia. Thanks very much. And thanks for everyone for tuning in.
Thank you.